dear friends, and happy Ramadan to you. What are the fundamental parts of a methodology chapter? How can a researcher produce a good methodology chapter? What are the fundamental components of this chapter? Is it a fundamental chapter in the first place, or is it only a luxury? These and other questions will be dealt with in the course of this video. The methodology chapter is a vital part of your thesis or your research paper for the simple reason that it answers one of the fundamental questions any thesis has to answer. The question is, how did you do it? Earlier in one of the videos, I made the point that the research objectives answer the question of what, and in the rationale, we answer the question of why. For the question of how, as I said, this is answered in the methodology chapter. But why should we care about how a study has been undertaken? The evident answer is that when we embark on our data collection, for example, or for that matter, when we take any step in the research process, if we go the wrong way, for example, in one of the steps, that threatens to bias our results. All in all, the methodology chapter, like any other part of the thesis, is a fundamental one. A thesis without a methodology chapter or without a good methodology chapter is one that amounts to a very bad thesis. Let's face the fact. Now, having talked about the methodology chapter, we move to the question as to what the fundamental parts of the methodology chapter are. I would like to serve notice that the fundamental parts, or what we take to be the fundamental parts in this video, may be subject to variation depending on the orientation of the researcher, depending on the recommendation of the supervisor. Some chapters may have less sections, but the common denominator among all theses are the following points. Point 1, an introduction. A restatement of the research questions and hypotheses, discussing the research design and justifying it, a word on the participants and a word on the instruments, and then the procedure, data analysis methods. If there is a pilot study, of course, we need to talk about it, and then validity and reliability concerns, and then a conclusion. We will try to develop individual points very briefly, of course. This is just to shed light on these basic fundamental elements. Some of these elements will be developed, as I said, in the next videos, especially the research design, qualitative and quantitative designs, of course, and then the issues of validity and reliability, because there is more information than is allowed in a video like this one here. So these are general orientations rather than, self-contained course on the methodology chapter. So let's start with the introduction. Like any part of a good thesis, the methodology chapter has to be introduced somehow. When I say introduced, I mean just a short paragraph that needs to be written, whose aim, of course, is to establish a connecting thread between what has been said before and what will be said in the chapter. We need this transition, not just when it comes to the methodology chapter, but in regard to all the chapters. One example, just for those of you who wonder how we can start this introductory part of the methodology chapter. One tip, for example, is to make a sentence like, in the previous chapter, a review of the literature in relation to concept X or phenomenon X or Y, so it depends on what you work on, has been critically reviewed. The relevant literature has been critically reviewed. In the present chapter, an attempt will be made to describe the different steps that have been taken in data collection and data analysis. Something like this. I'm sure you have enough creativity to produce your own transitions. Aside from this, we may have a second point in this introduction. It's talk about the organization of the chapter. For example, thus the present chapter is organized as follows. In the section that immediately follows, we will discuss research design, for example, in the second section. As for the third section, it will, etc. So you have all these linguistic tools to express yourself in this introduction. After we are done with the introduction, we move to the second very important section. The restatement of your research objectives and preferably also your research hypotheses. Many students, in fact, would phrase their objectives in one way in the introduction, but when it comes to their restatement in the methodology chapter, they wrote the same objectives, but in sometimes in totally different phrasing This is a mistake. Why? It's because we know that in language, when you change elements, in a sentence, you assume that they express the same idea, but there is a risk that you may mean something else. My suggestion is to keep your objectives as they are. State them verbatim. There is no problem with that. The next fundamental point in the methodology chapter is the section related to research design. Design refers to the roadmap, so to speak, that the researcher follows. It's like a plan when it comes to data collection, the designing of the instruments, administration. All of these elements fall under the heading of the research design. Of course, there are designs that are qualitative and there are designs that are quantitative. Very shortly, I will upload videos that shed enough light on quantitative designs and also on qualitative designs. So in this section, all that we need to do is state the design that we have selected, that we have adopted, and more importantly, this is something that I underline, try to argue for it. Say why. It's not a matter of choice. It's not a matter of preference, but the design is to a large extent dictated by your methodology and your research questions and hypotheses, of course. In one of my videos, I made the point that the objectives feed into hypotheses, and hypotheses will dictate our design. So as you can see, it's like a chain. I will open a bracket and talk about a mistake that is recurrent in a number of theses. Many students, because probably they are over ambitious, they spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of prose in talking about designs that they will not use. This is a mistake again. You may point to them and you may say why you have excluded them. Very briefly, that's fine. But being pompous, being verbose in talking about designs, if your design is one of the quantitative designs, then why are you going to define qualitative design and who talked about it and the different types of qualitative designs? That's a waste of time at best and a waste of effort at worst. After all, you're not writing a textbook. It's a methodology chapter. You have to keep the readers focused on how you collected your data and what logical steps you have followed. After we have talked about design, we can move to our discussion of participants / informants / subjects. Different people use different terms. If it's a questionnaire, then you can call it informant. If it's a test or whatever, an interview, you can refer to participants. Subjects is usually a term that is used in experimental designs. So whatever relation you choose, make sure that you develop a section where you talk about your participants in enough detail. Why? Because when we miss out on some of the important details, there are people who will think that you have camouflaged these details because you have not controlled certain variables. For example, if you are working with students, then you have to make sure that you include both males and females, and then you have to report that in your methodology chapter, in this section specifically. You need to talk about their linguistic background. If you're working on the acquisition of vowel weight, for example, among Moroccan Arabic native speakers, or you have to state this piece of information that all the students, all the participants are native speakers of Moroccan Arabic. Otherwise, people will say, well, you may have a heterogeneous class and there might be students who speak Amazigh or who speak other languages natively. You need to report as much information, as much demographic data, and as much information about participants as will inform your design. After we are done with this section of participants, we move to a discussion of instruments. Some researchers prefer to call it instrumentation. Data collection instruments are equally important for the simple reason that different research hypotheses dictate different research instruments. So enough detail has to be, brought up in this section. Generally, under the rubric of instruments, we name the instrument that we are going to use. We define it. This is one thing. The other thing that we need to do is describe the instrument in detail. If it's a questionnaire, for example, you need to mention the number of items and what variable items, of course, measure. For example, item 1, 2, and 3 measure, for example, the student's ideal L2 self. That's one variable in motivation. Item 5, 6, 7, and 8 measure students' learning situation. Item 12, 13, 14 measure students' anxiety or whatever. So these are just examples. So we need to do this. Before winding up this section, I would like to remind the researchers here that they need to insert a full copy of these instruments in the appendix. Some students choose to, and this is advisable by the way, to conduct what we refer to as a pilot study. What is a pilot study? A pilot study is a small-scale study that can be conducted only with few participants, 3, 4, 5, it depends. For example, if you have a questionnaire and you want to administrate to 80 students, then before administering it, it's better to try it with a very limited number of students, because this will give you feedback on the time allocated, for example, to the questionnaire. So many students believe that the questionnaire will be, filled out in 15 minutes, only to find out that it needs 40 minutes, if not more. So you get feedback on the amount of time that you need to state in the instructions. You also need, you also have this possibility of getting feedback on your instructions themselves. Because you are researchers, maybe you are familiar with sophisticated and technical vocabulary. The pilot study is a good opportunity for you to know whether the student has understood the instructions or not. Because when you ask them the question in the pilot study, orally or in written form, what do you think of this questionnaire? What are the difficulties of this questionnaire? Some of them might tell you that we do not understand this sentence, for example, or that. So it's better to conduct this pilot study because this will give you feedback on the changes that you need to introduce before the main administration. You need to report the initial version and what has changed. This way you are very perspicuous, you are very clear on, very transparent on the process, and this contributes to the answer of how did you do it. And in order to show that your study is both valid and reliable, we need a section here that can be entitled Validity and Reliability. Some students write validity and reliability concerns. It's good because you show that it's a concern for you. So in validity and reliability, all that we need to do is argue for the fact that your study has sought to achieve validity and reliability. What is validity and what is reliability? This will be the object of the next video because there is enough detail to mention. Here's a brief definition of the two concepts. Validity answers the question as to whether the study has measured what it purports to measure. If you are measuring the acquisition of something, then what have you done to make sure that you are measuring exactly these things and not something else? For example, reliability. When a study is reliable, it means that if it is conducted by another researcher under the same circumstances, the results are supposed to be the same. After we are done with this, we can move to the last section. This is where we tell the reader what data analysis methods we are going to embark on. If it is a qualitative study, you can talk about, for example, discourse analysis, content analysis, document analysis, etc. And of course, you mentioned the details, and you might also need to give an example of how you will do this. If it is quantitative, then you need to talk about the statistical measures, what variables you have, and what statistical measures you will be running. And like any other chapter, like any other part of the thesis, the methodology chapter needs to be concluded. One paragraph that summarizes the whole point and try to make a transition to the next chapters. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.